Welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, and I'm real glad that you could join us again. Going to have a conversation this evening with Mr. Daniel Simon. He's joining us to talk about GuardantINFORM. It's a platform featuring an extensive clinical-genomic liquid biopsy dataset of advanced cancer patients. Welcome to Health Professional Radio. Mr. Simon, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks for having me.
Talk about your work there and your role at Guardant Health, if you would.
Sure. I've worked with Guardant Health for over 5 years at this point. I lead Guardant's biopharma business. On the one hand, we have a team that works every day with oncologists to order Guardant 360, our 74-gene liquid biopsy panel, to see which mutations patients have and therefore to help support deciding which therapies to put them on. On the other side of the business, the biopharma business, which I'm involved in, we work with over 50 different drug development companies, helping them find the right patients for clinical trials, supporting analysis to see how patients do on their programs in development, or indeed which resistance mutations crop up, or how the tumors are evolving. We partner on things like companion diagnostics, as well as helping get more patients on clinical trials and work with them on real-world evidence, which we're going to spend the rest of the show talking about.
Now, GuardantINFORM relies on Guardant 360. Is that correct?
Absolutely. All of the data, all of the genomic data within GuardantINFORM comes from the Guardant 360 test that we've run now on more than 100,000 patients.
Well, if you would describe this GuardantINFORM clinical genomic platform for us.
With pleasure. So when a physician orders a Guardant 360 test, they'll ideally get a result back that shows that a patient has got specific mutations for which there are actual either therapy, approved therapies, or perhaps there's a clinical trial in development. And these genomic profiles in and of themselves are interesting and useful in various settings. But the GuardantINFORM database allows us to combine these genomic profiles with clinical data too, which makes the dataset of significantly greater interest to our biopharma partners.
So how do you envision the platform is going to be used by these pharmaceutical companies?
There are a number of different applications that companies would like to use this data for. We take the genomic profile, and it's worth stating that everything is anonymized and done in a HIPAA-compliant manner, but we create tokens for each individual, and then that same token is generated for claims data as well, allowing us to then match these data sets together. And there's a number of different applications. So, for example, companies are interested in which therapies patients are put on, if they have a specific mutation, and when they're on those therapies, how they do. If some of those patients are actually given a repeat Guardant 360 test, it's interesting to see how the tumor is evolving under the selective pressure of that therapy and what the genomic profiles of these patients look like over time. And then you need to see what the subsequent therapies that they go on are. And you can also imagine taking that data, and once you understand which resistance mutations crop up, that provides potential ideas for new therapies that might be developed. So, for example, one of the earliest EGFR inhibitors, called alotinib, or commercially Tarceva, that was launched for lung cancer patients. These patients would be put on that drug, and they do well maybe for 12 to 18 months, maybe longer, if they were lucky. But then at some point, the tumor would develop resistance. And if one does sequential tumor profiling of those patients, one of the most common resistance mutations that crops up is a mutation called T790M. It's a mutation at the amino acid position 790 in the EGFR protein, which means that alotinib can no longer bind to that protein, and the drug ceases to be effective. And so when AstraZeneca then set out to develop a next generation therapy for patients with EGFR mutations, they developed a drug that was able to work in patients with that specific mutation. And so you can imagine then thinking about the next generation of therapies when patients are put on osimertinib or Tagrisso, which was launched a couple of years ago now for those patients. In turn, they eventually also develop resistance. And so what are the next mutations cropping up you can develop therapies for to create another round of possible treatment options for those patients? And the final application is on the commercial side of the business, seeing perhaps when a drug is launched, how many patients within the Guardant 360 pool end up in that therapy, how long they're treated for, what else they're treated for. Some of the examples of applications here.
Over what time period are we talking about, and how many, I know an exact number may not be available right now, but are we talking a vast number of patients over a vast number of years or recently?
The Guardant 360 assay was launched back in June of 2014, and we have been able to match claims data to the vast majority of patients who have been tested with Guardant 360. But depending on where that patient is in the treatment journey, there may be varying degrees of data. So if the patient is newly diagnosed, say 2 months ago, maybe we'll see which, in the next data download, we'll see which therapy the patient was put on. But beyond that, we really then don't know a lot. Whereas if you take a patient who was perhaps tested with Guardant 360 back in 2017, they've had a couple of years to be put on a treatment, hopefully be on it for a good long time. Perhaps their tumor's evolved at this point and maybe they were retested. So every time we analyze the database, it's a snapshot in time. And with every passing month or quarter, the richness and value of that data set increases as there's more and more data for these patients.
What do you think is next for GuardantINFORM?
So the current data set is great for doing things like health economic outcomes research, for perhaps planning clinical studies, for looking for signals that might inform, as we talked about, drug development programs. What we'd ideally be able to do is to take this real-world evidence and use it to support further approvals for patients to expand further access to some of these drugs. And so another element of GuardantINFORM that we're beginning to develop is gathering data from patients' medical records, which will allow us to generate regulatory-grade data that could be submitted to the FDA. And there's a couple of interesting examples here, Neil, that I'll touch on briefly. Sometimes when companies are asked to do randomized controlled trials, particularly for what are often very rare patient populations, it takes a long time, and it's also very expensive to find all of these patients. And then, based on the study design, you've got to put a third of them onto the placebo control, or typically for cancer patients, it's the current standard of care. It could be immunotherapy, it could be chemotherapy. If we can actually use the GuardantINFORM database to help find patients who've already had that treatment, then all of the patients who are newly found with that specific alteration can be put onto the investigational therapy, thus potentially accelerating enrollment by up to 50%, and meaning that all the more recently found patients are put on this new drug. Of course, they may not do well on the drug, but we've already got a control set from the Guardant database. And if you push that, so that might be called an external or a synthetic control arm for a clinical study. And by using patient medical records, you can develop regulatory-grade data that allows you to point to each individual piece of information that the FDA requires to see. For example, when the patient was tested, what the result was, when they went on the therapy, how they responded when they came off it, or maybe when they died. If you push that to its logical extreme, we could potentially even develop completely sort of quote-unquote synthetic companion diagnostic submissions. So when a therapy is developed, a targeted therapy is developed, to get approval, if you're selecting a subset of the population, you've got to have a test that the FDA also approves to allow the drug manufacturer to find these patients to physicians to then put on that therapy. Yeah. Companies are often very interested in expanding the pool of patients to have access to their therapy. And so if patients are treated using the Guardant 360 assay, using that drug, which can, of course, be done as a lab-developed test, we could gather all of that data with the patient's permission and submit that as a regulatory package to the FDA and develop a follow-on companion diagnostic. As to whether one day that could be done as a de novo companion diagnostic is an interesting topic, but clearly you would have to find ways to get patients onto therapy in the real world. And so one way that could happen is if patients are treated off-label with a drug that's been approved perhaps in a different indication or for a different alteration, then you gather that data and submit it to the agency.
Where can our listeners get some more information online about Guardant Health, about the Guardant 360 assay and GuardantINFORM as well?
So at this point, I would point your listeners to the Guardant Health website, www.guardanthealth.com, We've got more than 150 peer-reviewed papers out in the scientific literature, a number of which are available through the website. And if listeners want to talk specifically about GuardantINFORM, please reach out through the contact details on the website, and we'd be happy to connect with them and share more about what we're doing.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's been a pleasure speaking with you this evening.
Good to talk with you, Neil. Thanks again for having me.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with Daniel Simon of Guardant Health. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Listen in, download it, SoundCloud, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/healthprofessionalradio.